Just had a conversation with somebody I've known on the internet for 5 years, but we haven't really spoken in 5 years. And we were exchanging observations on why it is that life in the United States of America is so unbelievably, intolerably awful. Stay with me for a minute here. I really think that most people who are born and raised in Europe, who have never been to the United States of America, they cannot imagine how awful daily life is in the city of Seattle. Many Americans will tell you that Seattle is one of the most wonderful cities in America, that it's one of the most pleasant to live in. Let me tell you something. If you compare Seattle to Brussels, if you compare Seattle to Perpignan, if you compare Seattle to second and third rate cities within Europe, daily life in Seattle is unbelievably horrible compared to life in those European cities. And I would go so far as to say there is not a single city in the United States of America, not one, where life is as pleasant as daily life in Côte d'Azur, south of France. Not one. Now, America has this tremendous reputation that is partly projected through television, movies, even things like sports that always seemed very strange to me. But when I was living in France, I had some tragi-comic conversations with French people who told me, because I was Canadian, we were speaking French, by the way. I don't speak French that well, but enough. And they told me that their dream was to move to Canada and live there. And here I was, I had just escaped from Canada to France. I was living in France. And I was applying to become a French citizen. And, when asked why, you're not too offensive, their answers often did revolve around watching sports on television, hockey, baseball, football. This was their impression of Canada. Not a single one of these people had actually visited Canada. So look, the main purpose of this video is actually to kind of challenge my own set of values and assumptions. At the beginning of this conversation with an old friend, I was bringing up, put it this way, I was bringing up points about life here in Canada, the United States, that I've said to my girlfriend many times, that I've said to my mother and my deceased father many times. I feel like fundamentally what we're dealing with here in Canada is an inestimable cultural deficit because we live in a country built on genocide. That the erasure of the culture that was here before, the failure to either preserve and promulgate that native culture, the failure to even have some kind of hybrid culture, interacting between Europeans and native people, which you could argue at least some areas in Mexico, at least some areas in Brazil have a kind of hybrid culture of indigenous and foreign parts. Instead, in Canada, the United States, you're talking about a total cultural genocide. And then on the basis of that cultural genocide, what did we construct? Can we even say this is a second-rate imitation of European culture? My girlfriend and I here, we very frequently walk past the opera here in Victoria, British Columbia. You probably didn't know there was an opera in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. Most people who live here don't know it. To call it a second-rate imitation of European opera is like an insult to European opera. And I don't care about opera. I don't valorize opera. My point is this. Anyone could look at the opera that we have here, which is, by the way, totally dependent on taxpayer support. It does not exist because there's a population here that loves opera the way that people in the Czech Republic or Amsterdam or Germany or Austria. There are many countries in Europe, Italy, that have a vibrant culture of opera. It includes both the people in the audience and the people on stage. No, there's nothing like that here on either side. This is taxpayers' money being spent by the government to create the illusion that we have some of this European culture here, European tradition, which we don't. In a much more subtle way, if you were to ask, why is the quality of education in the university garbage? Why is the quality of education in the high schools and primary school? I think it really is the same thing. I think that even though it's not as glaringly obvious as the extent to which the opera is terrible, our universities and our schools are kind of a hollow facade. They're this paper-thin imitation of European culture. I would even say that about our Constitution and our politics and our version of democracy. right? So what we have here in Canada in many, many ways is never going to be as authentic as democracy in Switzerland. We could try. We don't try. And when you're looking at the gravity of this genocide, you also have to look at the failure to achieve anything great thereafter. It's not as if Canada committed this genocide and then built the pyramids. We didn't. We committed this genocide and the country settled into this unbelievably mediocre suburban, hockey playing, marijuana smoking, video game addicted model of, development. And anyway, there are various factors of that too. The connection to European imperialism, British imperialism, French imperialism, also American imperialism. We could go into detail. Those are themes and topics I've reflected on before with my girlfriend, with my parents. People who know me personally have heard me reflect on those themes. What I'd say now that's really a bit different and where I'm challenging myself is this. We have a book here on the history of China. If you've studied the history of China in a formal university course, as I have, what you're told again and again and again is that the Ching Dynasty, this is Qing spelled with a Q, Q-I-N-G, the Qing Dynasty period is the lowest and the weakest and the most terrible dynasty in the history of China. It's decline. There's this whole ethic or ethos of decline is how the history. This is the nadir, this is the low point of Chinese history, after which we get the ascent into modernity, supposedly, right? The author of this book very bluntly argues the exact opposite. He says, no, this is maybe the greatest period of the Chinese Empire in many obvious and important ways, like military history. So if you actually care about battles, if you actually care about armies, if you actually care about conquering territory, this dynasty that everyone, formal historians, but also just generally, the way the culture remembers that period of Chinese history, what everyone's remembering is a period of weakness and decline and disintegration. It was actually the period of greatest strength. And they conquered huge amounts of territory, including Mongolia and Xinjiang. So China really increased in size permanently. And this guy is saying, he's an expert, I'm not. He's saying if you really study the battles, if you study the way the military was organized and how they fought and were armed, that this really deserves to be celebrated as something kind of impressive, as a tremendous goal. What this makes me reflect on is the extent to which we, as modern people with modern values, just fundamentally do not care about military greatness. Like, whatever type of greatness China had in the Han Dynasty or in the Ming Dynasty or in the Tang Dynasty or the Song, whatever the greatness is that we're talking about that we care about, it's not military. And whatever greatness or whatever weakness we perceive and we care about in the Qing Dynasty in that period has absolutely nothing to do with military strength. So I feel like in the year 2020, the evaluation of the strength of the United States of America very simply falls into these two separate yet strangely overlapping categories. What is the strength of the United States of America? Military. Nobody else has aircraft carriers like the United States of America. Nobody else has submarines that fire Tomahawk missiles. And by the way, the reason for that is those Tomahawk missiles can cost over $1 million per launch. Mind-blowing, the budget that has to go behind these things, right? Nobody else has ships that can fire long-range torpedoes, satellite-guided, with tremendous accuracy over tremendous difference, the way the United States does. Unchallenged naval dominance, unchallenged Air Force dominance, and yes, y'all, there's this little thing called the atomic bomb they have to back it up with. If what you care about is military strength, then of course, this is the golden age of the United States of America. Right? If what you care about is the ability to walk from City Hall to the nearest bakery without passing homeless people living in tents, without being surrounded by homeless drug addicts, and without being, let's be honest, afraid for your life. It's unbelievable how awful life is in every major city in the United States of America, in all cities the United States of America. If what you care about is the quality of education, cosmopolitanism, the character of the people, and just in a simple, unpretentious sense, look, I have a 7-year-old daughter. Would I want to raise my daughter here in Canada or in France? Would you want to raise your son or your daughter in downtown Seattle, in Los Angeles, or in a fundamentally functional city like Brussels in Belgium? Brussels is not the most romanticized city in Europe. Most people wouldn't even put it in the top 10 list of desirable places in Europe. But I would say there is not a single city in the United States of America that's as good a place to live as Brussels. All right? So yes, there's the quality of life, there's the character of the people, there's the quality of education, and there's the possibility of leading a meaningful life. All right? The type of wealth that matters to me, the type of power that matters to me, is not the wealth and is not the power that the United States of America has in such tremendous quantities. And I can say to you honestly, as someone who's lived all over the world, I used to live in a backward, small city in communist China. A city that Chinese people themselves consider poor and a bad place to live. I do not believe there's a single city in the whole of the United States of America that's as wonderful a place to live as that city in China. Right? And if you ask me why, it's all of these things taken together. It's the fact that that city in China has 4 living languages, that it's not built on genocide, that their indigenous people are still there and still living there, that they have this tremendous cultural depth that isn't just Chinese. It's actually several different cultures coming together. And it's the quality of education and the character of the people and their commitment to education. There are a whole lot of components that go into it. They're components that can't easily be replicated in the United States, nor in Australia, nor in Canada, nor in these fragments of the British Empire, built on genocide. They're all the impalpable things that separate a university that may have an opulent campus, opulent sports stadium, and a great football team. That's what American universities have. That's what Canadian universities have, right? And yet, there are all these important ways in which university education, high school education, all levels of education in Canada and the United States are an absolute sad joke compared to the universities of Europe, right? I mean, we're at a crossroads now. Figures like Bernie Sanders, even more explicitly the filmmaker Michael Moore, they asked the question, can America catch up with Europe? And the same question is posed. Can America catch up with Japan? Can America catch up with Taiwan? Taiwan has single-payer healthcare. Scotland has a socialized healthcare, public payment system for healthcare, National Health Service. I don't want to put it, right? There are some really obvious ways in which the United States is simply behind, and they're not just behind Europe anymore. They're also lagging far behind even compared to these countries in Asia. So if we can recognize that, if we can start asking those questions, maybe in the next 100 years, Americans and Canadians can start coming up with the solutions. But I've got to tell you, in terms of how I feel, at 41 years old, I just want to run away. I know I can have a better life than this in Hong Kong, in Beijing, in Dahong, even in Thailand. I know I can have a better life than this in like the worst city imaginable in Western Europe. It's very, very hard to live with the crushing compromises that 21st century culture imposes on us as Canadians and Americans.